November 1849. Boston was a city that believed in itself completely. It believed in its universities, its churches, its merchant families, its doctors and lawyers and professors who walked the cobbled streets of Beacon Hill with the quiet confidence of people who had never had reason to doubt that the world was exactly as orderly as it appeared. This was the city of Harvard, of the great Massachusetts General Hospital, of families so old and so established that their names were woven into the streets themselves. Boston in 1849 was a place where reputation was everything, where a man's word among the right people was worth more than any legal document, and where the idea that violence could erupt inside the walls of one of America's greatest universities was simply unthinkable. And then, on a cold Thursday afternoon in November, one of the most recognizable men in the city walked out of his house on Beacon Hill, turned down toward the river, and never came home. His name was Dr. George Parkman. He was 59 years old, rail-thin, with a jaw so pronounced that people who knew him said you could spot him from the other end of a long street. He was one of the wealthiest men in Massachusetts, a physician, a philanthropist, a landlord who owned properties across the city, a man whose family name was so established that he had literally donated the land on which Harvard Medical School stood. He was not the kind of man who simply disappeared. Men like George Parkman did not vanish from respectable cities on unremarkable November afternoons, and yet that is exactly what he did. Within days, all of Boston was talking about nothing else. Search parties went out. Flyers were posted. His family offered a reward of $3,000, an enormous sum, for any information about his whereabouts. The newspapers filled their pages with speculation. Fanny Longfellow, wife of the poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, wrote in her diary that a dark horror overshadowed the city like an eclipse. She said she could not believe the thing that people were beginning to whisper. She said no one could believe it. But 1 week after George Parkman walked out of his front door, the janitor of Harvard Medical College broke through a wall in the basement and found something that made Boston's careful, orderly world collapse completely. This is Soils of Crime. I am glad you are here for this one. Subscribe now and tell me, where in the world are you listening from tonight? To understand why this case shook Boston so deeply, you have to understand who these two men were and how completely they represented everything the city valued about itself. George Parkman came from one of Boston's great merchant families. His father Samuel had built a fortune trading silks and indigo, then turned that money into vast amounts of real estate across the city. George inherited the estate, grew it further, and by 1849 was worth somewhere in the region of $500,000, the equivalent of hundreds of millions today. He had studied medicine at Harvard, taken a further degree in Scotland, and traveled to Paris, where he had been personally taught by Philippe Pinel, one of the founders of modern psychiatry. He had returned to Boston and devoted years to improving the treatment of the mentally ill at a time when most people did not think the mentally ill deserved much treatment at all. He had donated the land for Harvard Medical School and funded the position of its first professor of anatomy. He was, by any measure, a man who had done serious good in the world. In his later years, he gave up the active practice of medicine and focused on managing his property empire, which spread across the poorer neighborhoods of the city's West End. He was known as a firm landlord, not cruel, but absolutely precise about money. He kept meticulous records. He expected his debts to be repaid on time and in full. He was not a man you wanted to owe money to, because he would not forget it. And he would not let you forget it either. John White Webster was also a Harvard man. He had graduated from Harvard College in 1811, studied medicine in London, and been appointed lecturer of chemistry, mineralogy, and geology at Harvard Medical College in 1824, rising to the Irving Professorship 3 years later. He was well connected by family. His mother was a Leverett, one of the oldest Harvard dynasties in New England, and his wife's family had connections to the Prescotts and other storied Boston names. His students called him Skyrocket Jack because of his enthusiastic use of chemical fireworks in his lectures. Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., who knew him well, described him as pleasant in the lecture room, rather nervous and excitable. By the standards of Boston's academic community, he was respected, likable, and thoroughly embedded in the city's elite social world. He was also quietly and consistently completely broke. Webster lived the way his social position demanded. A good house, proper furnishings, the right entertainments, the expected hospitality. But his professor's salary was nowhere near sufficient to support all of this. He borrowed. He borrowed from friends, from colleagues, from anyone who would lend. And the person from whom he had borrowed most heavily, most repeatedly, and most problematically was George Parkman. The exact amount Webster owed Parkman by November 1849 was somewhere around $480, significant in itself, but made vastly worse by what Webster had done with the collateral. To secure one of Parkman's loans Webster had put up his personal collection of minerals and geological specimens as security. This was a respected scientific collection, worth real money, and Parkman had accepted it as guarantee in good faith, but Webster, desperate for more cash, had then gone to a separate group of lenders and offered them the exact same collection as security for a completely different loan. The same items, pledged twice to two different creditors. When Parkman found out, and he did find out, he was furious in the measured, precise way that very wealthy men who are also very principled about money tend to be furious. This was not just a debt, this was fraud. And Parkman was not going to let it go. In the weeks before his disappearance, Parkman had been pursuing Webster relentlessly. He went to the Harvard cashier to collect money from the sale of Webster's lecture tickets directly, without going through Webster himself to apply it against the debt. He tracked Webster around Cambridge. He turned up at inconvenient moments demanding repayment. He was not physically threatening, he was too precise and too controlled for that. But he was absolutely relentless, and to a man of Webster's social position, the constant, visible pressure from a creditor of Parkman's standing was humiliating beyond anything that could be easily managed. On the 22nd of November, 1849, Webster sent Parkman a note arranging a meeting at his laboratory in Harvard Medical College for the following afternoon. The note said he would have money ready for him. Parkman replied that he would come. On the afternoon of the 23rd of November, multiple witnesses saw George Parkman walking toward the medical college. He was seen entering the building. He was never seen alive again. That same afternoon, Webster was seen by colleagues, attended to his laboratory, behaved normally, and went home to dinner. Nobody noticed anything unusual about him. He was, as described, nervous and excitable by nature, so whatever agitation he may have felt was simply absorbed into his ordinary manner. George Parkman did not come home for dinner. His wife waited. His family began to worry. By the following morning, the alarm had been raised. The search began. What was found inside Harvard Medical School 1 week later changed American forensic science forever. Stay with us. This is Soils of Crime. Subscribe if you haven't already, and drop a comment telling us where you are watching from tonight. Ephraim Littlefield was the janitor at Harvard Medical College, and he knew everything about that building the way janitors always do. Every room, every corner, every person who came and went. He and his wife Caroline lived in the basement, right next to Webster's laboratory. He lit the fires in the laboratories each morning, cleaned the rooms, moved the specimens, did whatever the professors asked. He knew Webster well. He had seen Parkman arrive at the building on the afternoon of the 23rd. He had not seen him leave in the days after Parkman's disappearance. Littlefield grew suspicious. He noticed that the furnace in Webster's laboratory had been burning unusually hot and continuously since the afternoon Parkman had last been seen. He noticed that Webster had locked the doors to his laboratory and told people he needed privacy for his experiments, which was not unusual in itself, but the timing was. He noticed other things too, small things, the kind of details that only someone who lived and worked in that building every day would register. On the 29th of November, 6 days after Parkman disappeared, Littlefield decided to investigate. He waited until Webster was not in the building. Then he got a crowbar, went to the wall of the privy vault, an old waste storage area beneath the laboratory, and started breaking through it. The bricks had been recently mortared. Someone had sealed the vault from the inside. Littlefield broke through anyway. Inside, in the darkness behind the wall, he found human remains, a pelvis, parts of a leg, flesh that had been deliberately preserved in chemicals used in the laboratory. He ran immediately and reported it to the police. A thorough search of the laboratory followed. In the furnace, investigators found more remains. Bones that had been exposed to extreme heat, fragments that had been almost but not quite completely destroyed. In a tea chest in the laboratory, further parts of a human body were found packed in tanner's bark to conceal the smell. In total, investigators recovered enough material to determine that they were looking at parts of one human being. But the remains had been so extensively burned, so carefully dismembered, and so deliberately stripped of identifying features that proving whose body this was presented a genuinely enormous forensic challenge. Webster was arrested on November 30, 1849, 1 week after Parkman disappeared. The news that he had been taken in for questioning spread through Boston like fire through dry paper. Fanny Longfellow wrote that nobody could believe it. Harvard librarian John Langdon Sibley wrote in his journal that Webster's uniform conduct and his standing in society made the charge almost impossible to accept. People who had attended his lectures, dined at his table, and walked with him at church simply could not reconcile the man they knew with what was being suggested. And yet the evidence in that laboratory was right there, waiting to be read. The question that had to be answered before any trial could proceed was simple and enormous at the same time. Could anyone prove that the remains found in Webster's laboratory actually belonged to George Parkman? This was 1849. There was no DNA testing, no blood type analysis, no fingerprint database. The science of forensic identification was in its earliest infancy, and most of what investigators could do came down to careful physical examination and the knowledge of experts who had known the victim personally. The task fell to a team of Harvard's own medical and scientific staff, men who were colleagues of both Webster and Parkman, who had to examine evidence in a case involving people they had known socially and professionally for years. The awkwardness of this was not lost on anyone. The Boston elite was being asked to investigate itself. Professor Jeffries Wyman, one of the finest anatomists in America, examined the bones recovered from the furnace and the other locations. He established that they were human. He established that they were consistent with the skeleton of a man of Parkman's height and build. He assembled what could be assembled, and showed that the remains represented a single body, not fragments from multiple sources. His testimony was careful, precise, and important, but the moment that truly broke the case open came from a dentist. Dr. Nathan Cooleykeep had made a set of dentures for George Parkman several years earlier. The process of making those dentures had been unusually involved. Parkman's distinctive jaw had required Keep to take particular care to make special molds, to fit the teeth with unusual precision. Keep still had those molds in his dental studio. When investigators showed him the teeth recovered from Webster's furnace, teeth that had survived the burning because they were made partly from mineral material, Keep did not hesitate for a single moment. He said he recognized them immediately as the teeth he had made for George Parkman. He said there could be no mistake about them. He had taken such particular pains with those teeth that he would have known them anywhere. This was the first time in American legal history that dental evidence had been used to identify a murder victim in court. The molds Keep had kept, the records he had maintained, the specific and unusual nature of Parkman's dental work, all of it combined to produce an identification that no amount of burning had been able to prevent. Webster had used the full resources of a chemistry laboratory to try to destroy every trace of George Parkman. He had burned bones in a furnace. He had packed flesh in chemicals. He had sealed a wall over a hidden vault. And he had been undone by a set of false teeth. The trial of John White Webster opened at the end of March 1850 and ran for 11 days. It was, by any standard of the time, the most sensational criminal trial America had ever seen. 60,000 people applied for tickets to attend. Tens of thousands lined the streets outside the courthouse. The newspapers covered it so thoroughly, so daily, and with such intensity that people across the country and even in Europe followed the proceedings as they unfolded. It was compared, even at the time, to the greatest public spectacles the century had produced. Inside the courtroom, the evidence was laid out with methodical care. The prosecution showed that Parkman had been seen entering Webster's laboratory and had never been seen leaving. They showed that Webster had been burning his furnace at extraordinary temperatures for days after Parkman's disappearance. They showed that the tea chest and the vault and the furnace all contained parts of one body. They presented Keep's dental evidence. They presented Wyman's anatomical analysis. They showed that Webster had been hopelessly in debt to Parkman and had committed fraud in the management of that debt. They showed that the fraudulent pledging of the mineral collection had been discovered by Parkman and had been the specific reason for their meeting on the day he died. The defense tried to cast doubt on the identification of the remains, arguing that the bones could not be conclusively proven to be Parkman's. They also pointed out that Ephraim Littlefield, the janitor who had discovered the body, who had lived directly beside the laboratory, who had access to every area of the building, and who had subsequently collected a $3,000 reward and retired comfortably, had equal opportunity and potentially a motive of his own. The fact that much of the prosecution's evidence rested on Littlefield's uncorroborated account was noted by the defense, but did not receive the weight it perhaps deserved. The judge presiding over the case was Lemuel Shaw, a close relative of the Parkman family by marriage. Nobody raised a formal objection to this at the time. Webster could not testify in his own defense. Massachusetts law in 1850 did not permit defendants to take the witness stand. He sat through his own trial in silence, unable to tell his version of events directly to the jury, while witness after witness built the case against him. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. They came back with a verdict of guilty. Webster was sentenced to death by hanging. Letters from across the country poured into the governor's office begging for clemency, some arguing Webster was innocent, some accepting his guilt but opposing capital punishment, some making the case that the crime had been unpremeditated and that he was genuinely penitent. Massachusetts Governor George Briggs read every letter. He refused to commute the sentence. After his conviction, Webster confessed. He said he had killed Parkman in a sudden fit of rage when Parkman came to the laboratory and taunted him, called him a scoundrel, threatened to expose him publicly, pressed him in a way that broke something inside him. He said he had not planned to kill anyone that afternoon. He said he had struck out before he could stop himself, and then had done what he did with the body out of panic, rather than premeditation. He wrote a letter to Parkman's brother Francis asking for forgiveness. Whether that confession was the complete truth or a carefully shaped version of events designed to make himself seem less culpable, nobody will ever know for certain. On the 30th of August, 1850, John White Webster was publicly hanged in Boston's Leverett Square. He walked firmly to the scaffold and fell 8 feet. A Boston merchant who read the account of the execution in his newspaper wrote that the people of the city seemed better disposed toward Webster after his death than they had been during the trial. Whether that meant they felt sorry for him, or felt justice had been served, or simply felt the relief of something terrible being finally finished, the diary entry does not make clear. George Parkman's funeral had been held on the 6th of December 1849, 2 weeks after his death, with thousands of people lining the streets of Boston in the winter cold to pay their respects. His widow and their 2 children, George Francis and Harriet, moved to a house on Beacon Street afterward, and became, in the words of those who knew them, virtual recluses. Neither of Parkman's 2 children ever married. The shadow of what had happened to their father seemed to fall across their whole lives, enclosing them in a grief that never fully lifted. The case of John White Webster and George Parkman changed American forensic science in ways that are still felt today. The use of dental evidence to identify human remains, demonstrated so effectively by Dr. Nathan Cooley Keep and his molds, became a standard part of forensic investigation. Every time a body is identified through dental records in a modern criminal case, a thread connects back to that laboratory in Harvard Medical School and the burnt teeth that Keep recognized immediately as the ones he had made with such particular pains. The case was one of the earliest demonstrations that physical science, properly applied and carefully documented, could speak for the dead in ways that no living witness could contradict. It also raised questions that were never entirely answered. Ephraim Littlefield retired comfortably on his reward money. The defense had pointed out that he had full access to the laboratory and the vault, that the evidence trail ran almost entirely through his account, and that a man in his position, one who supplemented his income by obtaining corpses for dissection, had more familiarity with human remains than most people. Some historians have argued in the years since that Littlefield deserved far more scrutiny than he received. Others maintain that the evidence against Webster was too overwhelming to have been planted or manufactured. The argument has never been conclusively resolved. What is not in question is the nature of what debt and shame can do to a person. John White Webster was not a violent man by nature. He was nervous and excitable and popular with his students and beloved by his family. He had gotten himself into a financial situation he could not manage, had made it worse by committing fraud, and had then found himself trapped between the exposure of that fraud and the destruction of the respectable life he had spent decades constructing. George Parkman represented all of that: the debt, the shame, the threatened exposure, the end of everything Webster had worked to maintain. When Parkman walked into that laboratory on the afternoon of the 23rd of November, he brought all of it with him. What happened in that room in those few moments ended 2 lives, one immediately and violently, the other slowly, over the months of a trial and a hanging and a family that withdrew from the world and never fully came back. Boston's cobbled streets look much the same today as they did in 1849. Harvard Medical School still stands. The records of the trial are preserved in archives and have been studied by historians, forensic scientists, and legal scholars for nearly 2 centuries. The case appears in textbooks on the history of forensic dentistry. It appears in legal histories as an early example of circumstantial evidence producing a conviction in a high-profile case. It appears in the story of Boston itself as one of those moments when the city's belief in its own order and respectability was broken open, and something much messier and more human was found underneath. George Parkman walked out of his house on Beacon Hill one November afternoon, expecting to collect a debt and be home for dinner. He had spent his life doing good, building institutions, improving the treatment of the sick, funding the education of the next generation of doctors. He ended up in a furnace in the basement of one of those institutions, identified in the end by the teeth that a careful dentist had made for him years before and had the good sense to keep a record of. He deserved a great deal better than the way his story ended. He deserved to be remembered as more than a victim. He was a complicated, serious, genuinely admirable man who had the terrible misfortune of being owed money by someone who could not find any other way out. Remember him. That is the Macabre case of Dr. John Webster and the murder that shook Harvard, Boston, and an entire nation in 1849. This is Soils of Crime. If this story has stayed with you, subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who loves history as much as you do. And drop a comment right now. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? Every single comment keeps these forgotten stories alive, and we read everyone. We will see you in the next case.